Welcome everyone to SOLIDWORKS Live Design, the show where we come together to get to know one another and learn, of course, from one another through the medium of live demo, which is exactly why we are here. My name is Sean O'Neill, and I am the host of today's episode of SOLIDWORKS Live Design as part of this holistic season on what we call deep dives. Now, what are deep dives in this sense? You see the graphical treatments, the underwater scuba dive stuff. Well, essentially, what we did was we brought together some of our favorite tech stars from the SOLIDWORKS community, as well as influencers, content creators on Instagram, YouTube that are focused on mechanical design and engineering to come together and share topics that they love, things they love for an hour plus. And so we basically pitched it as, hey, it doesn't have to be anything that you're thinking, this is like the number one, like most searched for topic ever. Yeah, great. I mean, that content should be made, of course, but it should be just according to the person that's presenting. What do they love, and what would they love to spend some time on to share their expertise with all of you. With that said, this is live. We have the little sort of graphical icon in the corner that says that we are live. We are indeed live. So please say hello in the YouTube chat if you're there. And of course, ask questions to the special guest, who is a photo rendering expert. He's a friend of mine. He has a background in mechanical engineering and design. He loves cameras. So I thought, when it came to views, cameras, viewports, there's probably no one better to talk to in that case than this guy, Jesse Sprague. Jesse, what's going on?
Not too much. How are you, Sean? That was quite an intro.
Yeah, I mean, what else are you? You're a dad. You love power tools. Like there's quite a lot to say about you, but I figured I would just stick to the topical stuff today.
Yeah, it's fair.
You're not ready for this energy right now.
No, I got my coffee. Still waking up.
But once again, everyone say hello to Jesse in the chat here on YouTube if you're live. Jesse, I mentioned a little bit about the topic of today's episode, which was purely of your choosing. I just said, Jesse, what do you care about? And this is what you said. But please tell us a bit more about how we're going to spend the next hour or so together here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah. So I think cameras it's a cool topic. We have an hour. You said an hour plus, so that means 2 hours, right?
Good.
I think it's a big topic. Obviously, there's a lot to it, but I think we can in an hour we can get some pretty cool information out here. I think that the cameras are tricky because we don't always necessarily have to be camera users to get into working with SOLIDWORKS, working with Visualize. And a lot of the terminology is kind of confusing with cameras as to like, what do I do with all these sliders to get what I want? But that being said, cameras are one of the easiest ways, I think, to improve the look of your images in SOLIDWORKS or subsequently in Visualize. So if there's a couple things that and you can intentionally set those settings and know what they're there and what they're for, it will make a humongous difference. So that's my goal for today, is to try to hit some of those things that could be confusing, or maybe you've used and you're not totally sure what they're for, and try to get everybody on the same page. So I've got a few slides to go over in the beginning. I know, collective groan. But like I said, I think that most of the battle in this case is just understanding what the things are and what you're supposed to be doing with them. And then finding them in the software is really inconsequential. You can find them pretty easily, but trying to figure out what they're supposed to be doing, that's the hard part, I think. So I've got a few slides in the beginning. We'll try to get everybody on the same page. And then we'll take a look at an example image that I made. I chose my wheel design. You may have seen it around. In fact, actually, I've got it in my background here. This little bing.
See that? Let me maximize you. There you go. Wow.
Bing.
How
Put
do
a
you
little
do that?
extra light on there just for today.
Can we spend an hour on that, please?
We could
do that too.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So if you've seen that model around, I'll use that for an example. And then we'll just kind of go in, take a look at the camera settings, and I want to compare and contrast them a little bit from what you do in SOLIDWORKS, because there are camera settings in SOLIDWORKS, and compare that to what you do in Visualize, because there are the same and different, and you'd want to know what to do where. So like I said, I'll spend a few minutes up front just kind of going through some basics. Then we'll take a look at an image, see how it was built, kind of decompose it, and then we can just jump in the software. So I posted on LinkedIn. I said, I need your help. Jump in the chat and ask me questions, because I obviously want to tune this to what's important to you. So I think if you're ready, let's get the basics in, and then we'll take it from there. I see we've already got a few questions in the chat, but we'll address those when we get in the software.
Love it. Let's do it.
Cool. All right. Sounds good. Yeah. So obviously this episode is mastering views and cameras. So the first thing that I want to talk about is exactly what I was just mentioning, and that is, what is the difference between just working in the viewport and working with a camera? So I have these kind of screenshots side by side here, and the left hand side is what I'll call the SolidWorks side. And that is working in the viewport. That's what we're always doing on a regular basis. You're in there and you're sort of moving the view around in a camera-like way. But that's not necessarily in camera settings. So you can set cameras up in SolidWorks, and we'll take a look at that in a sec. But you're normally just working in the viewport with camera-like settings. When you're in Visualize, though, you are always in a camera. So whatever your camera settings are that you have set, you can make multiple cameras and all of that. But whatever camera you have active, whatever those settings are, that is influencing what you're seeing in the viewport. So there is a little bit of difference between those two tools, and that in SolidWorks, you can choose to enter a camera. In Visualize, you're always in the camera because, well, that's kind of the point of Visualize, right? We're taking digital pictures with our digital camera, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. So there's a slight difference, and we'll take a look at that when we get in the software, but I just want to clarify that right off the bat. So what is important when we talk about cameras? I picked out a few things, and I put them maybe roughly in order of importance, or in order of things that you might want to think about anyway. So the 5 things that I picked out here are aspect ratio, the position of the camera, the perspective of the camera, what your aperture settings are, and what your resolution is. Now, the last one is not really a camera setting in our sense, in the software sense, but it is something that you would set on a physical camera.
Sure.
And that's kind of the analogy that I wanted to draw here throughout this, is just what would you physically be doing with an actual camera? And how does that apply to how we set things up in the software? Because that will help you link things kind of mentally as far as what you want to be doing with those settings.
So in terms of, let's say, if we're unfamiliar with cameras or digital images, I mean, what are we talking about? What are some sample resolutions that people might be familiar with?
Yeah. So as far as resolutions go, like 1080 resolution, you're probably more familiar with resolutions that get used for video.
Yeah, like if you're like on I guess the commonplace, I feel like a lot of us might see that as like a YouTube video. Like
right.
In terms of like we're in the passenger seat in a car watching a video and like setting the resolution of a video so that, maybe it's able to buffer a little bit easier, but it looks a little bit worse. Or if we want like the best quality possible, right?
Exactly right. And what gets confusing for a lot of people in this scenario when we're setting this is that the resolution is also tied to the aspect ratio, which hopefully I'll clarify when we get to these steps here. But the resolution is not the same as the aspect ratio, but they are related in that you'll need the number of pixels on the height and the width to come out to be the same as what the aspect ratio is. And that can get a little bit confusing. So let's use that as a jumping point here. And we'll combine these back to what a physical camera has. So I've kind of reordered these into what's doing what on a camera, if you're familiar with a camera or if you're not. So there's really 2 parts to a camera. There's the camera body and the camera lens. If you've ever gone to buy a camera, if you've asked somebody who knows something about cameras, you might have heard them say, well, you can buy a camera, but the lens is more important than the camera itself. And in a lot of ways, that is true. The lens is really what's creating how the image looks. So your choice of lens will probably have more of an impact than what your actual camera is. And in fact, a lot of people are surprised when they go to buy a nice camera, whatever that is to you, that they go to buy a lens and the lens costs more than the camera itself.
Yeah, I was going to say that was definitely at some point in my life a shock.
Yeah, a shocking revelation.
And it's like, man, I'm already shelling out X dollars for a camera, and I feel like that's a lot of money, at least for like personal use. And then all of a sudden, it's like, yeah, if you want like a really, really nice lens, or even just something that's probably better than, I guess, what you might call a kit lens, a lens that comes with this sort of stock, the base camera that you bought. It's going to cost, like you said, about what, like maybe more, but maybe like 80-90% the price of the camera sometimes.
Certainly. Yeah. And obviously there's a wide range of that we're speaking in generalizations here, but it certainly could cost as much or more than the camera itself. And they really serve 2 different purposes. So I've kind of reordered these. Obviously the position of the camera is that you're taking the whole unit, wherever you're putting your camera, whatever you're putting your tripod, that's the position of the whole thing. But the other 4 kind of get broken down in that the aspect ratio is set by the camera. So that's a setting if you're actually using a physical camera. That's something that you would set on the camera for images or for video or whatever you're doing with it. You would tell the camera, I want to shoot in this shape. Now, normally a camera has just a couple of options for what the common shapes are. We have basically limitless options in the digital world, and you'll find that that happens a lot. We have a lot more flexibility digitally than you would with an actual camera, which is kind of cool and can come in handy. But that would be something that the camera itself is handling. And we'll find that in the camera options as well. The resolution, that's something that the camera itself would be driving. That's a setting that you're choosing for video or for your images. In the camera, obviously, there's again some physical limitations as to what your camera can do, but we can choose what we want to do on the output side. So normally on a camera, you'd be setting that up front. In our digital process, you're setting that at the end. You can choose what you want to do after the fact. Now, the important ones.
I would say these are all really, I would say, someone that's done a little bit of photo rendering and someone that is familiar with cameras. You're definitely helping me make some connections that I don't think I had before. Even the last thing you just said, where it's kind of strange almost to where, like you said, before you begin shooting on a camera, if you're, taking photos or you're taking video, you're almost always, maybe I don't like to say always because I feel like I'm always proven wrong somehow, but like
Yeah.
I feel like you're trying to dial in your settings beforehand, or
Yes.
in a lot of cases you kind of have to, it seems, at least in my experience. Whereas in CAD rendering, a lot of the times you're kind of the output settings are they can be done. I guess they don't have to be done, but they can be done directly before like making a JPEG or a PNG or whatever.
Yeah, it's almost like you can slow down time, where with a camera, you've got in the time that the shutter takes to take the image, you've taken the image. All of your settings had to be baked at that point. When you take the image, it's set. But in CAD, we can take all of the time that we want to basically set things up and tune it all in, and then we can choose when that moment is that we want to take the picture and actually render it and send it out. So yeah, it's in a slightly different order, but I agree. I'm hoping that this will help people tie things together a little bit in even if you're not using a mirrorless camera like this, the same thing applies when you're taking photos with your phone, right? All of these settings are basically the same. All of our phones these days are set up to mimic an actual camera, just like our rendering software is too. So for perspective and aperture, those are 2 things that the camera lens is handling. And those 2 things are the reason why I said that the lens really does the heavy lifting when it comes to how the actual image looks. Obviously, the position of the camera makes a big difference. Where you're putting the camera, you're controlling the angle and all of that. But outside of that, the lens settings and the lens that you have on the camera, physically on the camera, will drive how an image looks more than you would think if you didn't know how lenses work. And obviously, we'll explore these settings as we go, but there's a lot more to it than just stick some glass on the front and take the picture. So let's break these down a little bit and try to get a little better grasp on what each one of these things does. So aspect ratio, I mentioned that right up front as the kind of top thing that you would want to set maybe first. And what aspect ratio is just purely the shape of the image that you're going to create. Now, this contradicts what I just said, because I said you should set this first, but I just said we can kind of slow things down and we can choose what we want to export at the very end. We have a ton of time. That is true. But the aspect ratio will really drive the framing of your shot. So the shape of the image may actually drive what lens settings you're using to be able to fit things appropriately in the image. So if it's an image that's super wide like this, you're going to get a whole bunch of extra stuff in frame than if you're shooting something that's perfectly square, right? So just a couple of common shapes here would be like an ultra wide or a widescreen or a square. Now you'll notice these aren't the numbers that Sean, you and I were just talking about. I said 1080, a normal resolution for 16 by 9 might be 1920 by 1080. That is not what we're saying here. That is not the aspect ratio. That's just some pixels, some pixel numbers that are set that divide out to be 16 by 9. And 16 by 9 is the actual ratio. So these are the kind of numbers that you'll see. These ratios are the kind of numbers that you'll see when you go to adjust the aspect ratio of the camera in softwares. So it's good to be familiar with how these are listed out, and that it doesn't actually have anything to do with the output size of the image. It's only the shape. So it's only in ratios that it's listed, and it's just how squashed or stretched is the shape of the image you're trying to create. And again, if you set that first, then that will drive everything else. You can frame everything nicely and get it to look the way that you want. Otherwise, you might have to go back and redo some things.
Yeah, and I suppose I guess some of this may seem arbitrary to some, I'd imagine, but I guess one thing that outside of outputting, right, just outputting an image, which usually that's kind of what we're aiming to do if we're talking
Yep.
about some sort of rendering or beautifying our CAD for some sort of reason. I suppose this definitely kind of hits on the destination for the image.
Yes.
Right. So like if we're thinking about, first thing that comes to mind, 16:9, usually like you could say desktop wallpaper, full screen image. If you're making something for social media, maybe you're doing a one-to-one. If you're doing some sort of presentation, maybe you have a different aspect ratio you're going for to try to fit it in somewhere. So yeah, this is a really good primer.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I'll say if you don't know what to do with it, I would say go with just a widescreen, 16:9. If you're not sure what you're going to do, I find that to be the most flexible. It'll fit in most scenarios. Most of our screens, as you just said, are 16:9. So if you're unsure, or you're just making a generic image that you're not really sure is going to be multi-purpose, maybe it'll go on the website, maybe it'll go in a presentation, you're not really sure what to do with it, I'd go 16:9. And if you can, leave a little bit of extra room on the sides where there's less activity. That way
Hmm.
you can always crop it down to the middle and get a square image out of it that still kind of works. To your point, square is great for social media things. So if you can make a square image out of a 16:9, then you can use it for even more applications. But if it's going on the website, stuff that I make with the web team often are pretty wide for the purposes of banners, or things like that that go into the web page, that 16:9 or a 1:1 would just not fit at all, or it'd have to be really cropped. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The destination of the image will be a driver of what you choose here, not so much style, unless it's some other case that's out of the norm. But yeah, if you don't know what to do, I'd say go with the 16:9 and try to keep the action in the middle, and that'll probably give you the most flexibility with the image down the road if you're not sure what it's going to be used for.
Cool.
Perfect. All right. So aspect ratio, purely shape, something we want to get out ahead of time. Now, position, this is just purely where the camera is. So this is just a quick animation and visualize of just think of literally grabbing your tripod, moving it around to a different location. There's really not too much to add to this. This is what we're typically doing in the graphics area. You're moving the camera around, you're getting it to the position that you want to get it to. There are some tips that I can give you for how to do this, and some shortcuts for doing this. But this is probably the easiest one to understand because it's what we're always doing in CAD. We're always moving the viewport around, or moving our camera around, quote unquote, to get to a different position, right? So you'll notice that the image looks roughly the same as the camera is moving around. It's just from a different perspective. And by perspective, I don't mean the actual angles in the image. We're just gaining a different perspective by moving ourselves physically somewhere else.
Yeah, the sort of you guys can probably observe this as well, but the sort of like blur that's happening as motion occurs is really neat.
Yes, and that's actually a setting that we may or may not have time to get to, but that is a setting in the rendering software that we can tweak. So you can actually control how much motion blur is available. Obviously, that only works in conjunction with an animation, so you would need Visualize Connected or Professional to make that work. But yeah, that can be a really cool effect. You can give something much more natural feel by adding in some motion blur, because our eyes actually see a little bit of motion blur. So that's something that we're always trying to recreate. Obviously, this I exaggerated it a little bit more just to kind of enhance the idea that we're flying around and having some motion here. But you can kind of tune that either artistically or just to try to make it look more natural.
Yeah, I love a good photo effect or video effect. It can really elevate things.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's let us know in the chat if you have a favorite effect, or if you found, if I just, add this mode or this setting, this effect, right? I can really elevate things. I'd love to kind of have us learn from one another, just like we're learning so much from Jesse here. And once again, those of you who have given questions already, we will get to those. Just kind of just getting started here.
Yeah, totally. I was just trying to give a quick scan on questions, but we'll get through this rough stuff in the beginning here.
Cool.
So position. I don't have too much more to add to this. This is what everybody basically knows how to do, I would imagine, and we'll talk about it when we get into software. Now, perspective, I said we're gaining a different perspective. That's not what I mean by this perspective. This, I animated what you would call like a Jaws effect, right? This effect in particular was made popular with that film where you're moving the camera physically. Right.
So you're dynamically, you're changing. If I gather this, you are dynamically changing perspective as we move closer.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
So what's happening is the camera is physically moving, and the focal length of the lens is also adjusting in the opposite direction at the same time. So as the camera moves in, the lens gets wider. And basically what you're left with is just a shift in perspective, which is very unnatural for us to look at. That's why they used it in Jaws, right? They were trying to make it look like very unnerving. But so this effect you probably wouldn't use out in the, in your rendering travels unless you're trying to make something crazy like this.
Take a shark's coming.
Yeah, exactly. If you're rendering sharks, perfect application for that. But in this case, it does illustrate well the difference a lens makes because it's sort of isolating the locations. A lot of times, even if you've used a camera before, you don't realize how much the lens focal length makes a difference, right? If you use a wide angle lens, you think, oh, well, I can just see more of the image than if I had a lens that was zoomed in. That is true. But if you combine that with physically moving the camera somewhere else, you'll end up with a lot more perspective. And you can see this even just with your own eyes. If you're, miles away across a lake and you're looking at a skyline, all of the buildings look pretty flat, right? They're sort of compressed, we would say. But if you go into the city and you're standing next to a building and it's, going way up in front of you, suddenly you have this crazy perspective. Everyone has seen images of it, even if you haven't experienced it in person, where the building just sort of like shoots up into the sky and you can see all of like the leading lines of the skyscraper or whatever. Suddenly have a ton of perspective because you're now closer to the object, right? Your proximity has changed. So, this kind of illustrates it well in that lenses do the same thing. If you have a long lens or a zoom lens that's zoomed into something from far away, you'll get a much flatter, compressed look. If you have a wide lens that's up nice and close, you'll get more perspective. So this is one of those things that I mean is a good example of what I mean by making intentional choices about your settings. You can make an image feel completely different just by changing the focal length of the lens to something that's appropriate for what you want to do. The longer the lens is, the closer to ortho view you'll get. So it just flattens and flattens and flattens and flattens.
There's some cool comments coming in. I just want to give a shout out to some of them. So Gabriel Martens, I believe is how you pronounce the name. If I am incorrect, my apologies. But Gabriel, you say the motion blur really gives it a smoother feel. Followed up by motion blur also works on components. Great for spinning components.
Yes.
Good point. And then
absolutely.
Extropian says, thanks for presenting live, looking really good, so realistic. It's a natural view for me. I believe you're speaking to perspective. That's what my eyes do to focus. And then we just showed bring on the sharks.
Bring on the sharks.
So thank you guys. Keep reading the comments. You don't always have to give questions, but if you do have questions, please put them in the chat here for us today. Yes. But any comments, crazy or otherwise, we'll take it. We're happy to be with you here today.
My son has been on this kick of books that he's found that are like animal versus, and one of his favorite ones is sharks. So it's like all sorts of different sharks, like if they were to fight each other, who would win? And then like it goes through this whole list of who would win out of all of the sharks. That's a good
series, man. I'm sure you gotta go dinosaurs. I'm sure dinosaurs are in there.
Yep, dinosaurs is one of them. Yep,
birds
insects,
of prey.
Reptiles. There's all kinds of birds of prey. Every night we read a different one that he brings home from the library. Bring on the sharks. All right, so that's perspective. Now, Aperture, this one for our purposes, you can think of this as manual focus because that's really what we're trying to do with this in our senses. Now, on an actual camera, this also lets in different amounts of light, so you're adjusting for that. But as far as artistic choices go, this is really what we're after. So on a lens. Actually, Sean, I've got a camera here in front of me. If you can full screen me, maybe we can
Yeah.
actually see. I grabbed this lens because you can kind of see it in here well.
Okay.
Let's see if we can actually get at it. If I can get the light in the right angle.
It looks so pretty.
Okay, can you guys see that? So see that hole in the middle of the lens? See how
Okay.
I'm
Yeah. Once you
see
said see the hole in the middle of the lens, I was
yeah,
able to
see it
focus
getting
on it.
larger and smaller.
Uh-huh.
So that's the aperture that's inside of there. That's a little better. I grabbed this lens because it has a huge aperture, so it's kind of easy to see.
Yeah.
So as I'm spinning the aperture dial, this is a manual lens, so I can just manually control this here. This is the setting that we're actually setting digitally. And if your lens is digital, you can also set this through your camera too. But this is what we're actually tweaking. So when the lens is physically small, or the aperture is physically small, you can see that the light would basically go straight in, essentially almost parallel light rays into the sensor in the back of the camera. If I open this all the way up, the sensor doesn't move, but now the light is coming in at a much steeper angle into the
Mm.
sensor. So it's converging at a steeper angle. And basically that's what gives us this effect that our depth of field has now gotten really shallow, so that we only have certain bits of the image that are in focus and others that are totally out of focus. And we can choose then with our focus ring, which would be the next one up on our lens, we can focus into what it is actually that we want to focus on. Now, the actual qualities of a lens, you can see there's some markings on the side here.
Mm-hmm.
That's what often you're paying for, is for a large aperture, physically large aperture capabilities on a lens. What gets people messed up is the markings on them are kind of confusing. So the aperture is set in an f-stop number, or if you're reading this one, is a t-stop number, but we're not going to get into that. We'll call those the same for our purposes. And the f-stop is a ratio, but it doesn't look like one. So you may see a lens marked f1.8 or f4 or something like that. The lower that number is, the larger the aperture. And that gets people messed up because the number that you see listed is actually a ratio to the focal length. So it's some ratio of size to the focal length lens that you have. So in this case, this is an 85 millimeter lens. This T 1.5 is a maximum ratio of the physical size of the aperture to the focal length of the lens. So it's 1 to 1.5. So that the lower that number gets, the closer to 1 you have, and that's a larger aspect ratio. So once you understand that, basically you need to go backwards from what you think you should do to get that number, or if you're used to cameras, you're used to that nomenclature. But a lower f-stop will give you more of this depth effect, and a larger one will give you less. And in the software, we can actually turn that off altogether, and you'll just have infinite focus, and you don't have to worry about it. But
it seems like this would be an area where, like, if you're getting into it for photography or if you're getting into it for rendering, like, that you just have, like, I think with a lot of these sorts of things, I like to just have like a handy one pager that has reference materials, and eventually I probably, like, I probably don't need it for any given thing once I've referred to it enough times, and I feel like my brain's kind of mapped itself around the ideas.
yeah,
But yeah, because like you're mentioning, there's so many areas of cameras where you're looking at ratios versus just, standard integer numbers, and
yes,
larger can be better or more preferable given an environment
or
or
the
an
opposite.
application.
Yeah, yep.
And some where it's like the ISO or ISO, I guess,
Mhm.
however that's typically said. It's one of those things
Yep.
where I'm always reading it but never saying it.
Yeah.
Uh,
I say
yeah, so like I always have to refer back to, like, am I supposed to be going for this if it's in the dark, should it be really high, really low?
Yeah, and so that you will find lots of, and that's a great point, to having a reference guide. So if you go online, you can find all sorts of camera reference guides. Those will be useful to you in rendering. All of those same settings and principles will apply. So you'll see comparisons where you'll get different lens settings, different aperture settings, and shutter speeds and things like that to get the shot that you want. Maybe you'll get more or less motion blur, or more or less depth of field, or whatever. You will see those coupled with ISO ratings that you were just talking about, Sean. ISO is just the sensitivity of the sensor these days, or formerly the sensitivity of the film. So as I mentioned, with this adjustment in the the aperture there, you can see that as I open that up, I would get way more light in this way than if I close it all the way down. I'm barely getting any light in at all. So you have a little bit more work to do with a physical camera, and that you also have to balance the exposure back out with how much light you're bringing in based on your artistic choices. We have less of that because we can control everything with sliders, right? So we don't have to go rebalance physical light in the amounts of what we're bringing in. So we can kind of just stick to our artistic choices, and we have more freedom in the digital world than we would with an actual camera, which is nice because you don't have that third variable to worry about of cranking the sensitivity up and down to try to get back to normal.
Makes sense.
Cool. Okay. Yep. So that's what Aperture does. And again, that one in particular, I think helps to kind of like link that in your mind to what a physical lens would do for you there. Now, lastly is resolution. This one, again, is one that we'll set on the way out. So we don't have to be too concerned about this in terms of camera settings. It's not in the camera settings for rendering or in CAD. This is an output setting, but again, I did put it in here because it's something that you want to be considering, in that the resolution in terms of numbers has to match up with your aspect ratio. Now, Visualize does a pretty good job in the background of actually adjusting that for you. So if you're off a little bit, it will actually go to max size in whichever direction it can. So there is a bit of wiggle room, I'll say, but it's definitely consideration, right? It's something that a camera would normally, you'd be setting on the camera. So it's something to consider here. And in this case, I just have a 16:9 image that's transitioning back and forth with a little pixel effect from 1920 to so like a 1080 image to like a 120 image. And you can see that the amount of detail that you're representing is way less with 120 there because you've got less little dots to do it with, right? So resolution is just how many little dots you're representing an image with. The more you use, the more detail you can capture.
Extropian asks, I just got a question here, just trying to keep up here. So Extropian asks, I feel like this might help with virtual world building. Is SOLIDWORKS for that, or just object showcasing? Interesting. I feel like it's almost become, and thank you for jumping on. I'm always amazed by the sort of diversity of the different use cases and users. I think that are that you think back 10, 15 years ago, it was mostly mechanical design, some industrial design, some layout stuff, but now, especially with the maker version, we just have all sorts of people jumping in, all sorts of use cases. And so, I think, I guess my take on it would be, Extropian, typically you'll find, I guess, with a SolidWorks and then by extension a SolidWorks Visualize, where we're taking the objects, the CAD, the computer aided design that we make inside the software, and then making it look more beautiful, more animated, ready for a business presentation, a website, whatever it is, kind of like Jesse mentioned. That's typically, I guess, what we're doing. We're kind of focusing more so on like a specific object, a design, a creation that we've created, some sort of mechanism, a machine, a product that you might see on store shelves, something we've maybe even just 3D printed for fun, and we want to make it look cool and beautiful. That's another reason. But we do have like areas where we have kind of more AEC style, different creations. You will see people doing facilities layouts, for example, inside of SolidWorks. So I'm sure out there you'll find that someone's made something resembling like a virtual world or something within SolidWorks. But typically you'll find that more so almost everything else I mentioned is where the neighborhood of a SolidWorks creation would be. Jesse, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, actually, because that sort of AR VR kind of thing does tie into cameras. Not something I was planning on talking about, but there is a section where you can create in your camera settings, you can set them to stereo. So you can actually render them out for the purposes of using with headsets. So you can actually set those settings to a particular headset and optimize for play on those. So if you're rendering an animation or even just a still image, maybe a 360 or whatever, you can, if you're building things in Visualize, export them pretty readily for those purposes as well, which is pretty great.
Nice. I see Eric just mentioned here. I'll pop that up so you can see Jesse if you're on our little restream app here. Come on, Jesse. The palette in that render is way too clean edged. You need to apply a beat all to hell texture map.
It's funny about that palette. So Sean, you asked me in our delivery day last episode, FTO2, where I find stuff
Oh yeah. Yep.
to put miscellaneous things that go into an image. Let me click over to the next one here so we can see it again. So this palette is actually one that I had in my garage. So sometimes if you're looking around, you can't find something, you can always make stuff. So this palette was one that I had in my garage. I got up on a ladder and I took a bunch of pictures of it from, side and top view and whatever. I modeled it up, including some of the cracks and things, and then projected the images back onto it. And that's where that palette model came from. So it was just one that I was sitting. You can even see where I was pressure washing some things on top of it, which is why it's got these weird lines all over the place in it. So yeah, you don't have something to use, just make it.
That's awesome. Wow. I'm so happy, Eric, you said that, because we wouldn't have heard about that.
Yeah. Right.
That's a really cool insight into how you get things looking real, because I think like a lot of us, I've heard this commentary before of rendering CAD, that things almost look too perfect at times to where it's disorienting. Because we know, like, if I look at my desk or if I look at my backdrop, like if I zoomed in on anything, you'd see imperfections. You see where my kid spilled juice, like 6 months ago, that maybe I missed it cleaning, that kind of thing. And that's maybe not always going to happen, but you're able to, as you kind of mentioned, Jesse, there are ways to make things look more kind of real world-ish.
Yeah, and some things have a lot of that. Like a palette is a perfect example. Like, to Eric's point too, these things get beat up and all sorts of stuff like that. So to try to recreate this texture digitally would be extremely difficult, to try to find all of these weird, imperfections in it. And sometimes you want to dial that out, like in your product itself, you'd probably want to dial that out a little bit. But in the surroundings, if you dial that back in, it has a tendency to trick people into thinking something's more real even than it was, because it just looks like, who would go to the trouble of, faking all of that stuff. But sometimes it's really not that hard, right? To take a bunch of images, project them onto a pretty basic model. This didn't take long to model, and project some, realistic actual textures back onto it, get pretty convincing. And I mean, we're pretty close to it with this camera here, and it still looks okay. So if you're pretty far away, it's very convincing. So yeah, it's a great way to go. Sometimes you can just make something on the fly that will work for you.
Awesome.
Okay, so let's go from here. And I said, before we get into the software real quick, I wanted to kind of break down like the anatomy of an image, so we can kind of use this as a reference. I just made this image up a little bit ago, just for our purposes here. And we can kind of break down what it was I did with the camera to get this particular shot. And that will kind of guide us in some of the settings that we just talked about, and why you might want to use it, or how it applies to a particular image. So the first thing that we'll take a look at is just the position of the camera. Now, obviously, position of the camera, I put this here because that's the easiest thing. However, it's not always the easiest to figure out where to put it. It's the easiest thing to set, probably, but not always the easiest thing to figure out where to put it. My recommendation is just to try a bunch of things. It's very easy to move your camera around digitally. We don't have any restrictions that the physical world would have. A lot of times when you're taking photos in real life, you're stuck behind, wherever you can physically get your feet or your body. We don't have that, right? We can make our camera as high as a roof or right on the ground. We don't have to go crawling around anywhere. We could just put the camera wherever we want. So
you're talking about, like, it sounds simple, but I guess just to make sure I understand, you're talking about like the physical location of the camera. Like, for example, like how I'm mounting it, just where I'm fixing it in space, how I'm orienting it. Okay.
Yep. And that's entirely just through the motions that you would normally do in CAD, right? We pan our model around, we rotate our model around. It's all that. That's all we need to do. There are other tools we can use to aid us in that process, but that's all that is. Just moving the view around to get your camera physically located where you think is an interesting location. So in this case, you can see the floor is pretty close here. We're only a couple pallets up. So the lens is pretty down close to the floor, and then we pushed into it. So we have a choice here between two things: physically where our camera is located, and what our lens is. So the next thing is, what lens are you going to use because that will also be an iterative process back and forth of physically where your camera goes. If you zoom your camera out, everything is going to look really small, right? I'm sure everybody's done that at some point on their phone or on a camera. You zoom out and it's like, whoa, everybody looks like ants because I just switched into 0.5 mode on my phone, right? It's the exact same thing. You could switch into 0.5 mode on your phone and then run up really close to something. And then suddenly everyone's like really up into the lens, right? But you're physically filling the frame with them. Or you could back way up and zoom way in, right? Those are your kind of choices there. So you would want to do those things in conjunction to get the shot. In this case, I think it was like a 24 millimeter lens. So it's relatively wide and relatively pushed in. And that is for the reason of that perspective that we were looking with the Jaws effect before. I wanted it to be a little bit more pushed in. So it kind of the wheel itself sort of feels like it can reach out and grab you more so than just, a flat, maybe product photography style thing. A little bit of more emotion there. So we've got the physical location combined with our lens choice. What lens are we going to use? And then the next thing is our aperture setting on that lens, right? We talked about that animation with the depth of field that was coming in. So we have a low f-stop number here. So we've got a very shallow depth of field. You can see the image falls out of focus very quickly, even so much so that, elements that are just barely in the foreground are already falling out of focus. And there's a very thin plane of what's in focus compared to if we cranked that up and had a high f-stop number, we would have everything in focus, or if we just turn that option off. So this is a combination of setting our aperture value. So we have a shallow depth of field and then choosing where we want the focus to be. So the focus is kind of in the center of this wheel here. Those two things in combination give us that artistic effect.
Jesse, there's a couple questions in the chat, and thank you guys for continuing to deliver these. If you wouldn't mind, maybe we can get to here.
Sure.
So Gabriel asks, did you create PBR maps for it, for the model?
Yes. So the wheels themselves, no. So those are just kind of procedural that were, I think, all of those were just right out of Visualize. The palette, yes, the palette is PBR texture that is either unwrapped or just projected in cube projection. I don't remember what I did there. I probably unwrapped it because I think the bottoms are different than the top. So yeah, I think I unwrapped that one, but used a PBR texture for the palette. Yep, good question there.
And then one more. So for Extropian, I'm kind of wondering if the creation can be switched between its drawing. I can imagine trying to look between camera angles while switching in between can allow for getting all the angles right. Yeah, this is also like another, like in terms of doing this digitally, way less expensive because I don't know about you. I knew about you. I do know about you. I don't know about everyone else that may be watching live or kind of, after it's been live and they're watching the recording today. Either case, welcome. But once I have a view set up for my camera, I have everything kind of dialed in. I'm really hesitant to change anything.
Yep.
Like I don't want to change it. It's like, don't touch it. Don't even look at it.
Yep.
So this allows you to almost have like infinite seeming possibilities to where that anxiety goes away. So there's so many, but yeah, I've said too much.
100%
on the question.
Yeah, no, and I will address that in more detail in just a second. So okay. I agree. I agree with that comment. Cool. So we've got some depth of field built in there. We've chosen a focus. Again, this is kind of like our manual focus, if you want to think of it that way. And then from there, once we get that shallow depth of field, we can add in some other adjustments. So a relatively new option in Visualize is the ability to actually tweak what the bokeh looks like in the background. So this effect is what you see here in the background, where we get this this shape. So anything that is a highlight or a light in the background with a lens that's wide open or is a physically large aperture, you'll get all of these little speckles that kind of blow out into these cool shapes. These are dependent upon the physical nature of the lens itself. We actually have some control over what we can do with that. That was new for FD01 and Visualize. So I made some adjustments to that, just made some, intentional settings to that. And then from there, turned on bloom. Now, bloom, you can think of this as like a mist filter that would go over your lens. So you can see areas here where we have some highlight. You can see this has kind of got this haze or this glow around it. We have manual control over how that looks and where it happens. And we can choose to turn that on and off. Now, this is an effect, obviously, that you would get naturally in a lens in different lighting scenarios. So we can choose to add that if we want to. This is one that's easy to overdo, but if you do it a little bit, it can add a little bit of realism to it as well. So I put that in there because it's one of the settings we can talk about.
Jesse, I just have to say, seeing it this way, the way you're presenting it is super helpful
Cool.
for me. I think because I didn't create this image, so I'm just kind of watching along with everyone else here, and I'm sure you guys kind of probably feel the same way. But I kind of stopped at a moment when I was looking at it. I was thinking, like, you're adding all these effects, and they all add a little bit to the image,
Yes.
a little bit to the quality of the image. You're just kind of piling them on, and you know, most people don't get to see this process, right? Most of us don't get to see it by definition with most of the images that we see on a daily basis, right? You see the final result. You don't necessarily see how they got there or the methodologies for getting there or the effects that are used, right? But I really like kind of fading into these different areas of just additive effects as we kind of learn what they do.
Yeah, and hopefully, my goal isn't to make this seem overwhelming or like, oh man, there's like 50,000 things that I've got to dial in to try to get an image that looks good. This is all stuff that will become pretty second nature to you. I mean, most all of these are check boxes and then a couple of sliders. And once you kind of understand, like I said, hopefully tying it back to a physical camera a little bit will help you try to figure out what it is you would have done in real life. You can tune those in pretty quickly or get 80% of the way there, in 5 minutes. And all of the things that I'm talking about here have nothing to do with the lighting or the appearances, or this is just stuff that you can set up in the camera settings that, to your point, Sean, all of these little things will stack up a little bit and just add a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. One of the things that I get asked the most is, how do you create a realistic image? There's no photorealistic button, right? In any rendering software, there's no button that just does that. It's all of these little things that you are making intentional choices about that will stack up and add to the image. And you can choose what you want to include in the image and what doesn't, whatever fits, right? This image is kind of a warm and bright image. So the bloom makes a lot of sense. And the depth of field makes a lot of sense. It's more of an artistic feel. So you can choose when and where to use those things, but the sliders, as I said at the beginning, the sliders themselves are inconsequential. It's just knowing which ones you want to use when. That's the whole key to it, right?
Yeah. Gabriel asks, this is interesting, is there any way to add a fog effect with cameras or within the software that we're talking about here?
Sort of. So, I mean, the bloom is kind of what the fog would be. And there's a threshold slider. We can take a look at it once we get there in a second.
Okay.
So you can actually adjust that. I've turned this way, way down. So it's barely there.
Okay.
But if you crank this up a bit, it would kind of go over the image much more. So there's that. But then also there are camera filters. So if you wanted the whole image to just take on a tone, you can just set a color that would kind of give a sort of a haze across the whole image. But we don't have any like volumetric appearances like some other softwares might have actual like haze that you could add in that would catch the lights and things like that. We don't have that there.
Man, it's so interesting just to talk about this stuff at length, because you think about how simple that request is that you mentioned earlier to make things just look realistic.
Yeah.
But we don't consider, at least we often don't, right? Unless you really sit with it, how many things come together for things to look realistic to you.
Yeah.
And how easy it is for things to not look realistic to you.
Totally. Yeah. And that's why people get frustrated, I think, with rendering, is that there's a lot to know. There's a lot that goes into rendering. And you can identify things that don't look right very quickly. We all spend our entire lives just looking around, collecting data that we don't even realize we're collecting. And then when you see something that isn't right, I mean, we're faking all of this, right? It's all approximation.
Right.
So when you see something that doesn't look right, you instantly know that it doesn't look right. What do you need to do to change it? that's up to you to figure out as the artist, right? So that's the disconnect where it's really easy to get frustrated. It's like, this does not look good, but I have no idea why. And yeah, so those are just the little things that you have to learn along the way to make the tweaks. Okay, so we've got all of those. We got the physical location. We've chosen a lens. We've chosen our aperture size and our focal distance. We've adjusted our bokeh effect to our liking. We've turned our bloom filter on and turned that down a little bit to get this image looking the way that it is. Now, aspect ratio. I said to put that first, and I intentionally put it last. In this case. Did I trick you? Did we forget about it? Right? Yeah, maybe. So remember, this is something that is the actual size of the whole image. That's something you set at the beginning. If I change this now to a square image, maybe it'll fit, maybe it won't, right? In this case, I kind of left some blank space here on either side. So yeah, maybe we could go down to a square, but if we go wider than this, what's over here in the scene? I don't know. I wasn't really paying attention to that. I was just looking at what is in frame at this particular aspect ratio. So, again, just a reminder, always a good idea to set this first, and then all of these settings that you're tweaking make more of a difference, because if you suddenly see more or less of your scene, then you might have to go back and choose a different lens length, or, physically move your camera back or whatever to get things back in frame again. So another not so subtle reminder, try to remember to set that first, because it's one of the easiest things to forget if you're doing something other than maybe a 16:9, which might be default.
That's huge. Yeah, I mean, I've done that.
I have as well.
Personally,
Many times.
yeah. I'm pretty sure everyone here has that's ever done anything like this. Yeah, it's startling when you have to change at the end and you realize like the composition sort of everything just doesn't
work anymore.
it's just gone. It kind of feels like it's gone for us. I mean, you can get it back, or you can make adjustments, however, given the context, whatever you're doing.
Yeah,
yeah,
totally. And
so
sometimes maybe you can't even make things fit, right? You might have to physically move things around in the scene, or add some more, or take something away to try to get it back to balanced again. Because if you made this super wide, then maybe the only thing you could do is just zoom out and try to get it somewhere. But then you've got a whole bunch of real estate that's just totally empty and looks weird. So yeah, definitely, if you take anything, try to get that first. If you're making an image especially if you're making an image that's a different shape than what you normally work with, get that first, because it will drive a lot of the other decisions that you're making.
Cool.
All right, sweet. So let's, from here, let's jump into the software a little bit, and we can kind of go as we go and answer questions as we go too. I've got SOLIDWORKS and Visualize open. I want to jump into SOLIDWORKS first, because I think this will be the quickest. We can kind of go through some of the options in here, and I'll say what I like to do in here, what I don't like to do in here. Then we can jump into Visualize, and we can just bomb around in there for a little while. So I mentioned right off the bat that the viewport is not the same as setting up a camera in SOLIDWORKS. And what I mean by that is, usually when we're working in SOLIDWORKS, right, we're rotating our model around, we're panning our model around, and we're zooming in and zooming out and working on stuff. Normally, we're doing that in an ortho view. And a lot of people, when they get done, they've finished the model up or whatever, then they'll go in and say, okay, let's switch this over into perspective mode. And then you can manipulate the camera in the same way, right? The camera is the same. It's just that we've gotten some perspective in here. Now, most people generally don't like to work in perspective mode, just because it makes things a little bit harder to see, right? You get up close to the model, and now suddenly none of your edges line up, and it's like, wow, I'm looking at this in a weird way, like through a camera lens, which is exactly what it is. So I would say, if you're not familiar with using perspective mode, generally I would recommend to leave that off while you're modeling and working. And then if you need to create an image, or you just want to, get an eyeball of what the thing looks like a little bit better, you'll notice that this looks very unnatural. Once you toggle perspective on, it's like, oh yeah, that looks more like I would see the product with my eye. But it does make it harder to model with it, because now suddenly things don't quite line up.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're making a YouTube thumbnail.
Yeah.
If anyone makes YouTube videos for any reason here, or has, obviously we've all seen YouTube thumbnails. Like, you can make something, let's say it's 16:9 aspect ratio, but it's really large, and it looks beautiful on your screen, right? It's nearly full screen. You're modeling it up in Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever you're using, and then you want to see it kind of in a different orientation, right, where it's kind of smaller, right? This is kind of taking that to a different level, but this is maybe a space where you just want to use it almost like a toggle switch every now and then, as you're going, to kind of get an idea of how it might look in more
I
of a
think
real
so.
world sort of view, right?
I
I
think
guess
so.
another thing I'd mention, is like you were saying, you can turn it off and then you can just save your template that way. I feel like you and I are always saying that, but like
Yeah.
at the risk of being repetitive, I always say, like, if you have a change where you want to keep something off by default, just like save your part template, with perspective off if you don't want it on by default. And so
Yeah.
any new part you make, it's going to be like that.
Yes. Great point. And obviously, this is totally preference. You can have it on and off whenever you feel like
Mhm.
it, but generally, this would be toggled on. Really, if you're just trying to get an eyeball on it and say, okay, yeah, this looks a little bit more natural to me. Now, interesting thing about this, a lot of people don't realize that this is actually adjustable. We see that it's
That blew my mind when I was like, what?
me too. So it's just a toggle button here. We turn it on, turn it off. You'd think, okay, well, there's nothing else I can do with it, right? I can turn it on and I can turn it off. Nope, not the case. If you go into View, Modify, and go down to Perspective, you'll see under the Modify drop down here, we can actually tune this to the amount of perspective we want. So this is actually doing something similar to adjusting the focal length of the camera and our physical location. And you'll notice that they actually give it the description that I gave before when you're like looking at a city from far away, or whether you're standing up next to the building, you get a totally different perspective, right? You get a totally different view of what that object looks like. That's exactly what this setting is doing. So it's saying, are you up close to the building or are you way far away? So the default here is set to 3, but if we turn this way down to like 0.5, suddenly we have crazy perspective right in our SolidWorks viewport.
Yeah.
Or conversely, if we go the other way and set it to like 30, now we have a much more ortho view, right? If we leave it here and toggle our perspective on and off, we barely notice any change at all, because the higher that goes, the closer to ortho view we get,
I
the less
see.
perspective is even there, right? Where if we turn that back down again, view modify perspective, and turn this down to 0.5 again, and then we toggle it off, we'll see now a much more significant difference between ortho view. Like ortho view almost looks ridiculous when you compare the two that way
Yeah,
to a
it's
much wider perspective.
awesome doing this with a circular shape as well.
It
So
is, yeah,
you
really
really
gets
see the difference.
exaggerated.
Like, that is not even a circle anymore.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's a toggle that you can turn on and off. So it's like camera-like functionality in the viewport, but we're still not in a camera. So let me go turn this back so I don't turn my perspective back on and wonder what in the world happened. We'll set this back to 3, back to the default. So okay. And now let's turn this back off or go back to ortho view in our viewport. Now, SolidWorks does have cameras. So I mentioned that you can choose when and where you want to use them. So if you want to put a camera into SolidWorks, you can go right over here into our display manager. And if you click on the scenes button at the top, you'll see all of your scene information. Camera is one of the options in there. So you can right click, add a camera. And this does kind of what we were talking about with one of our comments. I apologize, I forget who already said that already. But we have this cool side-by-side thing going on where we can look at where the camera is physically, and then we also get a camera view on the side with this little dual pane. And we've got like a side-by-side view here that we can interactively work with. So we can adjust this one like we would, just directly in the graphics area. And you'll notice that as I'm doing that, it's physically moving the camera around. Or we could do the opposite and move the camera settings and, move this physically as if we're now, controlling the camera, and do it either way, but they're linked. So whatever way is most comfortable to set up the scene for what it is we want to set it up for, we can do that with both of these panes at once, which I think is a cool little system.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, like, if you like, if you like, I feel like we've all probably done this. You have your webcam, it's turned on and you're kind of adjusting it. So I feel like that's the left side's my eyes view, and then the right side's what I see on my like camera app in Windows.
Yeah, that's actually a great analogy. Yeah, you're kind of, you've got a monitor and also your adjustment pane at once. Now, you'll recognize hopefully some of these settings more so than maybe you had in previous to the session, if you didn't already know what they were. We've got a target point, so we can set the target by selection if you wanted to set this onto something so that the camera will rotate about that particular point, so we can kind of lock things down. We can do position by selection as well. So if you had physically modeled a point where you knew like this is where I'm going to put my tripod and lock the camera onto that, you can do that if you want to. But down towards the bottom here, you'll see some hopefully now familiar options where we have the field of view. Perspective is turned on by default because generally that's what you're wanting to do with the camera. You're wanting it to look natural to what your settings are. And then underneath here, you'll see the actual lens preset. So we've got a 50 millimeter standard, but if you hit this drop down, you can see that you can just pick your lens for what you're putting on your digital camera. You can do a 24 millimeter wide angle, 35, 50, 85, 135, 200. Those are all very common lens sizes for actual physical real lenses. So you can choose what it is you want. And it's kind of nice that they give you a little call out here too, like 24 millimeter, that's a wide angle. So you know what you're actually getting into. We've got a 20 millimeter as telephoto. So you can think of that like your zoom lens. So you've got a little bit of a reference there for what those selections are going to be and what they might do for you.
I get a little bit of anxiety just seeing that drop down. I feel like I'm on like a photography website or something, and it's going to change the price to like $950. This one's
Yep.
1,010. It's like, oh, I know.
Yep. The price and the size. One of the nice things in software is you don't have to lug around a telephoto lens.
Yes, very true.
Checkbox. It weighs nothing. That's a benefit. Now, again, one of the things that I'll recommend, aspect ratio in SOLIDWORKS is a little bit nonchalantly hiding out down towards the bottom here. Really particularly easy to forget if you're setting things in SOLIDWORKS, I think, because it's kind of the last thing. It's like an afterthought towards the bottom. But you'll see these ratios that some of which I mentioned earlier in the session. We've got like a 1:1. There's a 4:3. That's a common 16:9, right? So there's all of these different aspect ratios that you can choose. Again, don't let this just pick for you. Pick intentionally what size you want to make those, and you'll see that the bounds of the camera now change to adopt this aspect ratio and then include your settings. Now you can also set this manually if you don't want to go with a standard lens and try to change these angles and it gives you some kind of reference up here. I don't recommend doing this. I would say just stick with one of the lenses here that are available unless you need something really specific, and then you can tweak it. So just pick one of those, set your aspect ratio, and away you go.
Really neat. Yeah, so I suppose in this sense, when we're defining a camera here in SOLIDWORKS, is this influencing, for example, if I saved an image directly out of here, or if I transferred it over to the sort of visualize area, how is that sort of affecting things?
Yeah, great question. So I never do that. So I just showed you all this cool stuff, and I was going to follow that up by never use it. That being said, I think there's value in talking about it again right now, because we have API add-in for Visualize that we just talked about, where we can now write custom code that will allow us to export our renderings out and render in the background with Visualize. More of that is coming. So the more things that tie the rendering process back to SOLIDWORKS, right? We've talked about, DSPBR formats and everything coming in, and all of that consistency that we as a company are working on between SOLIDWORKS and Visualize. That adds more and more benefit of doing things in SOLIDWORKS. I still suspect I'll find myself doing all of my rendering work in Visualize. I actually prefer having a separate environment that's just my studio, if you want to think of it that way. But I know that there are a lot of cases where it makes sense to just be in SOLIDWORKS and say, doop, send that out and give me a picture. So yeah, in those cases, already we can import, to answer your question directly, we can already import those cameras into Visualize. There is a slight conversion process because they don't all use exactly the same variables, but it'll get it pretty close. So if you do have cameras set up in SolidWorks for some purpose, you can make use of them in Visualize or, adjust them from there. Generally, the only main purpose for me for setting up a camera is for rendering. So I just do that in Visualize. But again, to my earlier point, there are becoming more and more reasons where it might make more sense to do this here in SolidWorks, or to have the option to do it here at SolidWorks and then be able to ship that out the back door, if you will, into a rendering process that will just do it for you.
Sure. Yeah, we have to, at some point we have to make some sort of video or some sort of, I mean, even now it's like you mentioned the API topic, where you're basically taking a model that you have and then shipping it off to Visualize through some sort of automation background automation, and then offloading the rendering of the object into Visualize sort of in a silent capacity, right?
Yeah. And the main reason that I don't do that right now is because you lose a bit of control, right? You don't have any control over what the appearances do when they get there, or your lighting, or it just uses the defaults. As you can tell, we've been standing here talking for an hour about just camera settings. I like to have a lot of control over things. But I do know that there are lots of good reasons, good solid sound reasons to use that process. If you've got 1,000 renderings to make that are going on your website, it's not realistic to go through and tweak every single one of those to your liking.
Trade-offs to do.
It's not practical, right? So there are a lot of cases where it makes sense to be able to ship that right out and get something that looks spiffed up, and that's good enough, right? So that use case definitely exists, and this is a use case for cameras in SolidWorks where I think that added benefit will keep stacking up over the coming few releases even.
Cool.
So worth talking about, even though it's not something that I currently use. Okay. Any questions on SolidWorks? Type fast before I shut this down. And we'll move over to Visualize, and we can talk about cameras in there. I'll wait just a couple seconds for you to peck away if there's anything that you want to talk about there before we move over to Visualize. How are we doing on time, by the way?
We're definitely in that deep dive territory.
We are.
We're in the deep end.
We no longer see the sun. It's dark down.
Pool water's getting cold now. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it's awfully chilly.
It's an hour and 6 minutes so far. Right. So thank you all for watching.
And again, to my point earlier, the actual buttons in the software are very easy to find. So we don't need to spend a ton of time in the software, or we can spend as much time as you want. But we don't need to spend a ton of time. Really, hopefully at this point, my goal is just to link what we've been talking about to here it is in the software. This is where you click on it. Okay. Looks like we're good. I'm going to go ahead and shut that down. Don't save. And we can grab Visualize. We can jump over here. Back to same image that we started with. So when we're working with cameras and Visualize, there's a couple things. In SolidWorks, we had that dual pane thing, the two pane side, not T-pane, two pane, side by side thing. We can do that actually in Visualize as well. So if you go under View, multiple viewports, you can do multiple viewports and you can link them to different cameras. So if you really like that setup where you've got multiple views, you can work with that. So you can have one as a monitor, and then you can choose what you want your other one to be. You can do that as well. I'm not going to do that just for the sake of screen space here. So I will put this back to single. But just to mention, that is a possibility.
Does that start to bog down? I know obviously with any program like SolidWorks or Visualize, anything that's CAD in some way, performance it can be a concern, or something at least to monitor and be aware of.
Yeah.
As you add those, do you start to see a performance hit, or?
I don't notice it too much. It will auto turn ray tracing on for the one that you have active. So it will try to save performance there a little bit. If it's a large model, I would probably not do that. But on small stuff, I haven't really noticed too much of an issue. To be honest, I don't use that too much. Once you get pretty comfortable with the camera settings, you'll navigate your way around from being within the camera pretty easily. But if it's something that helps you at the beginning, I definitely recommend people giving it a try if it helps out, because it will kind of do that linking in your brain of, oh, okay, I see what I'm doing. Sometimes it's hard to tell when you're in the camera, like where am I going? But when you see it from the outside.
Yep, I've had that same thought.
yeah, it can definitely help. So yeah, feel free to use it or test it, right?
Yeah,
See if
sure.
it works for you. You can always turn it right back off if you feel like it's slowing you down. Now, for cameras, I recommend always having 2 cameras, if not more, in Visualize. And this is usually my method. I will have whatever my main camera or cameras are, and then I will have one that I just named free. The reason for that is because I can go right into general and lock this for the exact reason that Sean was just saying. When you get a camera set the way that you want it, it's like as soon as you bump it, you will never get it set that way again. It's gone.
No.
You
Yeah.
could set all of your parameters back to exactly the way that they were, and it won't look right ever again. So lock is your best friend there. And this is exactly how I work most of the time. I'll get things dialed in the way that I want them, lock it, and then I have another camera that I can use for any of my other work. I can go back in and, do whatever I want to do. And I have just got an extra camera that doesn't need to do anything. At any point, I can switch back to my main camera and then I can see how things are looking. Or again, you could use the dual pane if you wanted to do that.
Yeah, I love that.
So that's usually my method. And I find that is something that people struggle with just getting started with the software. It's just you have one camera and then it's like, well, how do I do anything else? I've set up my camera the way that I want it and now I'm stuck, right? To add a camera, just right click, new camera, or you can duplicate one that's already there. Control D on a camera that exists will just give you another one. So I do this pretty frequently where I get something pretty close, then I just duplicate it and say, let me see if I can find a better fine tuning of this camera. If I can, I'll just get rid of the other one. So there's really a no risk scenario. You can just duplicate it and do whatever you want with that duplicate. If you don't like it, get rid of it. So to your point earlier about just trying different iterations, and to my point earlier about trying iterations, you can try all sorts of different stuff in here with no risk. Right? You can either start from a starting point or start from totally scratch with a camera and tweak your settings in the way that you like it. If you don't like it, just send it on its way.
Makes sense.
Now let's unlock this and let's take a look at this, because this is where people will generally get overwhelmed pretty immediately when you go into the camera settings, but it's not as bad as they look. So I have this unlocked, which now opens up all of our settings. And let's talk about this in respect to this image, just like we did through the that list of the kind of breakdown that we did earlier. You can give your camera a name. I recommend doing that. It just makes things easier to find in the tree if you're using multiple cameras. So name that. Keep above floor. This option does exactly what it sounds. So if that is turned on, which it is by default, that won't let the camera go below the floor, which is normally what you want. If you're trying to get an upshot through an invisible floor, that will prevent you from doing that. So just be aware that that checkbox is there and it's on by default. So if you tried to go up from the bottom, can't do that unless you check that off. Now, the first thing that we see right at the top, which is one of the things that I like about this setup, is the aspect ratio. So you'll see that this is dialed into 16:9, or I can hit the drop down. It will give me some common ones. We can switch our orientation, which I do occasionally, right, for social media and things like that. You can do landscape or portrait. And underneath here, you have all sorts of presets for different purposes, which is really nice. So you don't have to really know all of these different aspect ratios. You can choose from common ones, or if you're using it for print or international print, you're for photo or web or TV, all of the standard sizes are right in here. And you can say, this is what I'm trying to use the image for, set it for that. And then you'll have that aspect ratio already built in, and you can choose whether you want it to be landscape or portrait. So right at the top, I think right where it should be, again, for that, an important selection. Generally, I'll leave that on 16:9, as I mentioned earlier, and then change it when I need to change it. Underneath that is this option here, which is perspective. This is not one that you'll probably be making adjustments to unless you want to do something like I was talking about earlier with the VR or something like that, interactive stuff. So you can see that we can make this a 360 camera. Perspective is the default. That's just, through the camera lens, or ortho if you want to take the perspective totally out. Generally, if you're in Visualize, that's not what you're trying to do. So perspective is the default for a reason, and that makes good sense there. Now, when we look underneath this is our lens settings. So hopefully this ties back to what we were talking about earlier with the physical lens. Now, what I think people get a little bit confused with here is we have a perspective slider and we have a focal length slider. Now, these two things look like two different options, and they are not. So these sliders are tied together. So you'll notice that if I change this, both of those sliders are moving together. So that's why I say when you look at
How about
this,
that? That's
when you
interesting.
look at these options and you're suddenly feeling overwhelmed, it's actually kind of almost double the options sometimes, because they give it to you in two different ways, depending on how your understanding of it kind of works. You can adjust it as a perspective, which is crank up the amount of perspective. Or if you understand camera terminology or whatever, you can adjust your focal length directly, saying, this is the kind of lens that I would put on my camera if I were going to actually go take this shot. Now, as for a lot of these settings over here, at least the like transform and settings like that, I will generally not set them here. I will set them right in the graphics area. This is a perfect example. One of the coolest things I think that Visualize has built into it is this little shortcut. So of course we can take our camera and we can move our camera around to get it to a place where we want it to go. By the way, if you're not familiar with Visualize, all of this noise as I'm rotating it around, that's the ray tracing catching back up with us again. And I do have my my denoiser turned on. So as soon as it snaps and goes away, it's just doing an automatic denoising in the background so we can get a quick idea. So as I'm making those changes, we can move our camera around to wherever it is we want to go. We can use our scroll wheel to zoom in and zoom out. Now you'll see as I'm physically moving the camera, my depth of field is changing because I have this locked kind of in manual focus mode. So let me go change my depth of field. Let me turn this off for the time being. This is everything now in focus. And we can physically move our camera around. This is what I'm doing most of the time. We're just rotating our camera around. We're panning right up and down to get the camera in the area that we want to go. We can use our scroll wheel. Again, that's our dolly in and dolly out. Now there's a couple shortcuts that I really use all of the time. One of them is to use the shift key with the middle mouse button. And that is a more controlled dolly in and dolly out. So you can see that's much more smooth than just using your scroll wheel on the mouse. You can get that dialed in a little bit better. But when it pertains to perspective, the Alt key is one of the coolest shortcuts that you can make use of in Visualize, because if you hold Alt and you use your scroll wheel, you can directly adjust the amount of perspective and or the focal length. And you can see I'm basically recreating that animation that we had at the beginning there by dialing in and out the amount of perspective. So it's changing a couple things there for us. It's changing the physical location of the camera and also what lens I'm using. And I can directly dial in the amount of perspective. This is a huge benefit over doing actual photography, like for in real life, because you would have to actually be swapping camera lenses out or, zooming them in and out within the range that you're trying to get, and also physically moving your camera around to try to figure out what look you're actually after for these. So if you leave with any shortcut, the Alt key and the scroll wheel would probably be one that I recommend, because we're all pretty comfortable with getting the camera in position, but then once you get there, you can kind of very quickly scroll in and scroll out with your Alt key held down and figure out how much perspective you really want to get the feel of image that you want. Very intuitive interface, I think, on that one.
Yeah, the bokeh effects in the background as well is pretty trippy to watch as it adjusts.
Yeah, totally. And you can see I created that now that I have my depth of field turned off. You can see that I created that with just some little lights in the background that I just used a scatter pattern on and just kind of spread them out in the background, added an emissive texture to those. And then when the depth of field is turned on and we have our bokeh effect adjusted, you'll get all of those little cool effects in the background that are just from those little lights that I have just kind of hanging in there and blend into the background.
Very cool.
So again, once we get our perspective set up, just like you were saying, Sean, we can turn on our depth of field if that's something that we want. We can adjust the focal distance of this, or we can just pick. So if we click on pick and we could choose an area where we want that to focus on, it will then just focus in that area. That's basically like hitting autofocus or clicking on your phone to tell it where you want it to focus on. That will pick that region, or we can set a distance manually.
So is that just attaching to like a face, or?
Yeah, it's not attaching. It is just it's just picking that distance far away from the camera as the focal point.
Okay, so it kind of does some sort of like shoots a ray basically, and like the first thing it hits based on where you clicked, it
Yes.
will. Okay, I see.
Yep. Yep. And if you move your camera, you'd want to refocus. Remember, we're in like manual focus mode once we turn on depth of field.
Cool.
Yep. And then underneath that, again, we have our aperture settings, which I said in our purposes are basically for artistic control, right? So we have our f-stop here. That's when I was adjusting my aperture to large or small. That's exactly this here. So we have this slider that if we slide it up to a larger number, a smaller, physically smaller aperture, you'll see more is in focus. If I drag this back down, less is in focus. The focal point isn't moving. The distance itself isn't moving, but the amount of the image that's in focus falling out and in front of that point is changing.
Yeah,
Right?
that's very stark.
Yep. And again, if you turned this off altogether, that would basically like having your f-stop just go all the way up to infinity or something, right? It would be basically just an infinitely small setting. Now, again, you don't have to use the bokeh effect. If I turn the bokeh effect off, you'll see that I still get some of that effect. We can see they're basically just round little blurs in the background. So you still get that out of focus effect. The bokeh effect that was new for FDO2, that just gives us more control over it. So you can see when I check that on, I have this blade count set, and that now controls the actual shape of the bokeh. The blade count is just how many blades, physically blades, are inside of the lens. And different lenses have different qualities. You'll find older vintage lens might have fewer blades, or for different purposes. So that option is more tuned towards photographers. This is particularly nice if you have a bunch of images that have already been taken. Maybe you have some artistic images of a product that's already been taken and you want to match some renderings to those. You can actually match the physical lens that was used and get things a little bit closer, which is pretty cool.
That's a really neat idea.
Yeah. Or you can just use it for, your artistic purposes and make a choice there. All right. So hopefully that list is now significantly less overwhelming, right? There's really only a couple things in there that we need to know. The lens hopefully makes more sense. We're just making a choice, and you don't even really have to make a choice. To be honest, we have infinite options. You can just use your alt and scroll wheel, figure out what looks good to you, and roll with that. There's nothing wrong with doing that at all. In fact, that's what I do most of the time. And then our depth of field options, if we want to use that shallow depth of field, we can check that on, tweak that slider for f-stop a little bit. And again, you'll notice I didn't call this out specifically, but the aperture and the f-stop are, again, it's another duplicate slider. So if I drag this, you'll see they just do the inverse of each other. I find this actually a little bit confusing. I think maybe we should do one or the other, but I do see where they're going because a lot of people might not be familiar with the actual camera terminology, and then you don't know what to do with these sliders. But I do find it could be potentially a little bit confusing that we've got two inverted sliders that do exactly the same thing. All right. But again,
I would say
hopefully that kind of cleans up.
Just on the whole, Jesse, yeah, I mean, you mentioned, hopefully this is a lot less confusing than it may have otherwise been prior to the presentation, particularly the terminology exploration that you took us through at the very beginning. And I would say for sure, I mean, there is a certain reference point in our minds, or at least in my mind, for nearly everything that you just went over.
Cool. Good. And if we go across here real quick, transform, you don't have to worry about this tab because you can just physically move your camera around, right? I'll turn off my depth of field here just so we get a little clearer, right? We can just physically move our camera around. If you want to zoom in on a particular object, one thing that I'll often do is just select it, hit home on the keyboard, and that will move my view right to that object. And then I can make adjustments from there. And we really don't have to mess with the transform options of the camera too much unless there's something particular that you're really trying to do, or if maybe you're trying to lock the camera to a particular object or whatever, you can do that there. But very rarely do I find myself physically in here, in this tab, clicking around and making adjustments. Richard early mentioned in my LinkedIn post that he uses the twist by a little bit there. You can definitely do that. The Alt key will give you a twist as well. So if you hold Alt and hold the middle button down, or you can actually rotate that. If you hold Control and Alt and scroll, you can kind of dial that in too. So there's ways to get to those right from the graphics area as well.
Very cool.
Stereo is what I just mentioned for AR, VR. Filters, this is what I mentioned about potentially using something like this for fog, right? You could do a color filter, vignette, adjust your saturation. This is just like sticking filters on the end of the camera lens. Again, this is nice if you don't want to do any post-processing and you can get stuff to look right just in shot. Generally, I'll do a little bit of post-processing on things as they come out anyway. So I typically will not use this, but it's great if you don't have an option for doing that. You can dial things in a little bit closer by just using the built-in filters. Bloom, again, what we just mentioned here. If I turn off bloom, you'll see this a little bit. Those highlights are now just straight highlights. If I turn on bloom, we get that sort of haze around them. And I mentioned that you can also turn this way up, right? And by default, it's actually quite a bit higher. So the more you crank these up in terms of intensity, brightness, and also the radius, you can see that now this kind of haze that's coming off those is almost, you can't even tell where it's coming from, right? It's kind of going across the whole image. And threshold is just how much is actually being picked up.
It's crazy how differently the image looks and how it feels, like it's just based on adding that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And again, the nice thing with doing this kind of thing digitally, to your point, versus physically, is there's no penalty to dragging any of these sliders. So, right, there are pretty good tool tips on these, but go in there and start dragging things and see what it does. I mean, it's writing is one of those things. If it looks right, it is right. So don't be afraid to get in there and just drag stuff. You can always just put it back the way that it was, right? Or just delete the camera and make a new one.
I mean, yeah, it's like anything that is visual or in its own nature or by its own nature is not, textual or verbal, right? It's like the easiest way to learn something visual is to see a visual difference, right?
Yes.
Anything else, anything else that's in text is just a text-based description or best possible version translation of something that is natively something else. So totally. Just like mess with sliders, basically. It's like the moral of the story.
Yep, we've taken an hour and a half to say mess with the sliders, and you'll be fine. Yep.
Well, now you have a better idea, everyone here, including myself, of which sliders to mess with, right?
That was my goal. Yep, know which sliders to mess with. That, and honestly, that's really it. That really is. Just know which ones you might want to be using. Drag them until you get it looking the way that you want. Last tab over here is advanced. The only reason why I'll go in here is for motion blur, because we talked about motion blur before. So this is something that you can turn on. You mentioned that I used it in the location one earlier. You will also you will have to set up some keys for this. Some kind of motion needs to be happening in order for motion blur to have an effect. But you can adjust the shutter time. You don't even have to know what shutter time means, to be honest. You can just drag this up to get more motion blur. You can drag it down to get less. So you don't have to really even understand the settings for that. There's only one slider. So more, less, that's all you need to know on that one. And also rule of thirds overlay is kind of convenient. You can turn that on if you want to use that as a guide, which I will sometimes do and sometimes not. You can see this image is not really making use of the rule of thirds too much. Obviously, I moved my camera around, but even in the final state, I didn't really honor this rule of thirds too much, but sometimes it's really useful to do that. So definitely a helpful option to have. And also note that you can do foregrid as well.
Yeah, that's rule of thirds would be a great thing after this show to Google. And look at examples of.
Yeah, rule of thirds or golden ratio or something like that, for sure.
Very neat.
The only other thing that I'll add in here, because this is something that I didn't even know until I was putting this together, was there's actually a shortcut to move the camera as if you're moving it on the tripod, which I didn't even know this was here. So I'm using Control and Alt on my keyboard and the middle mouse button. I think actually it lists Shift and Alt in the shortcuts, but it seems like both work for whatever reason. But I have never used this in my life, but I'm going to use it now because I didn't even know that was there. So you can obviously what you're normally doing is the inverse of that, right? The camera is focused on a point and you're kind of moving around that. but you can also just invert it and just pretend you're at the tripod, moving your camera around, and do that way, which could be really great for some fine tuning.
Yeah, that's kind of that's really cool. I mean, it was nice. It was cool to see that, and I could definitely see using it for sure. It just depends on. I feel like Richard early was saying. Kind of if you're because sometimes if you're making something digitally, changing something you can have in your head. Okay, if this is like point to whatever that's describing, point to over this way or over to the left, right? It's like
Yeah.
that feels more natural and more native to my intention than just trying to move it a smidge, right? Like physically or with my mouse or whatever I'm using.
Yes.
And so I can see it. And so like you're saying, like I think given where my headspace is of how I'd like to alter the image at a given point in time, that might feel more natural to me, right? To actually move it as if I was holding the camera for just a moment, even if it's
Yep.
just for that moment. And the rest of the image setup, the rest of the camera setup is actually using a lot of the other methods you've already shown.
Yes, I totally agree. Now, when it comes to shortcuts, the only thing that I want to mention in here is the way that I found this. F12 on your keyboard is the shortcut to know if you don't know any other shortcuts,
Okay.
because that brings up all of the shortcuts that are available. You can also search for them. You can see I made my own profile because I have some customized.
Hmm.
So you can customize them from within here. You can add your own profile. You can search for them within here. So if you ever forget what the shortcuts are, um, you can just go in and start searching for them, and you can see, okay, these are all the camera related shortcuts that I have to work with. So I do have some shortcuts listed here that I have used throughout that little quick demo as ones that I use regularly. We've mentioned all of these except for Control G and Control J. Control G turns the ground grid on, and Control J is the matching tools. But a great way to do it, just hit F12 and look through there and remind yourself of what some shortcuts are, or print out a sheet. That way you have them. And these, I think, if you do this on a regular basis, will become second nature pretty quickly. And you'll find that you won't really have to go digging in the options too awfully much. And you can do pretty much everything right from the graphics area and just kind of stay immersed in setting up the composition of your image.
Sweet. Yeah. Grab a screenshot if you're here to watch this. This is a good one.
Definitely.
Awesome.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm never tired of talking about cameras. I can keep going on forever.
No, that's the whole point of this. Yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
Do we have any questions that we haven't cleaned up yet? Maybe we should take a look through questions. We got some.
No, I think we got to most of them.
Great.
I think many of you may be coming from PhotoView 360, which was
Yep.
not the first ever rendering package hosted or provided by SolidWorks, but was one that a lot of people used for many years. That after a year's notice, we did eventually sunset. We didn't just say, "Hey, it's gone." We gave years and years notice of saying like, "Hey, we have Visualize. You probably have access to it today. Many of you are using it. We know. Eventually, we're going to try to put more of our development efforts into that. So yeah, a lot of you probably have at least heard of PhotoView 360 from the sort of annals of SolidWorks history. And so I think Ivan asked a question, about how to replicate or get some of very similar effects from a PhotoView 360 rendering into Visualize. I think through a lot of depends on the spirit of the question, but I think a lot of the things that you showed us today probably mapped directly, even when you went from SolidWorks to Visualize, kind of showing comparisons of different sort of camera-based terms or photography-based terms, and how similar, if not same named options and features are in the SolidWorks interface with cameras as well as Visualize when you're setting up your different views. But yeah, it's something I guess we could always follow up on. But yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, and I'll just comment on it quick. So there's in your import settings, and I think I might have saw some responses to this already in the chat, but in your import settings, you can choose what comes in from SolidWorks. So PhotoView 360 was a built-in rendering tool. So it was making use of what was in SOLIDWORKS already. So when you bring something in to Visualize, there's a row of checkboxes that you can choose off to the side to choose what you want Visualize to bring in. Cameras being one of them, but you can bring in scenes and all of that. So you can choose what you want it to try to match as closely as possible once it gets into Visualize. That would be the best place to start. One of the great things with Visualize is it's GPU and CPU enabled, so it's a lot faster than PhotoView ever was.
Yeah, noticeably. I would say noticeably so.
Noticeably so. And obviously, the better graphics card you have, the more performance you'll see in there. But the nice thing about that is you can, if something needs adjustment, you can tweak it way quicker than you would have been able to in PhotoView 360. So I would say import as much as you can from SOLIDWORKS. Make sure you're using if you have multiple viewports or cameras in there, make sure you're checking to make sure you're using those for those particular images. And then if anything needs adjustment, you should be able to tweak it pretty quickly. And if you're bringing in the environment at the same rotation angle, the lighting should be pretty similar. So yeah, it should be relatively seamless. The camera does get converted. Your appearances currently get converted because they use different types of appearances at the moment. But all of that stuff will be getting smoother by the day, actually.
Cool. Thanks for the summary on that, man, and thank you for spending so much time and energy with us here today on
Totally.
this deep dive. Awesome deep dive. I wanted to show this. So this is your channel.
Yes.
I wanted to highlight. If you liked the content that Jesse so generously provided us today, definitely search for Solid Ideas, just solid space ideas on YouTube, and you'll find the channel. Jesse, do you want to say a couple words about the spirit of the channel?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's me. And of course, we highlight this when I haven't gotten a video up in like months. But yeah, it's not anything that's like official. It's just I wanted a place that I could kind of put some things that were on my mind and things that I was excited to share about, tips, tricks, things like that. So it's just a place where I have a repository where I can share things. I miss making videos that are just instructional stuff. It's all just how-to stuff on there of things that I find interesting and hopefully helpful. So yeah, if you want to follow along, I need to get back and get some stuff. I have a list that is like miles long of things that is in progress or is ready to be made. So I just need to find time, which has been at a
time is the
premium
challenge
lately. I'm about 5 projects behind at the moment. So I apologize to those of you who are already following me on there. Yeah, it's been really busy lately. Sean, you've been sucking up some of my time with Delivery Day, which has been a ton of fun. Another shameless plug for that. If you guys aren't following Delivery Day, shoot on over there because you'll pick up things like Bokeh, which was a recent addition where Sean and I will go through all of the new features for a particular release. But yeah, just a place where I can have some fun, share some ideas, stuff like this, basically.
Awesome. Once again, like you said, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who have watched today. Just like Jesse said on his slide just a moment ago, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next month for another edition of a deep dive from our community here on SOLIDWORKS Live Design. Take care, guys.
Bye, guys.